Welcome to the Stoic spirit. If you're here, it's probably not by accident, because what we're about to unpack might shift the way you see yourself and how others see you too. See, truly intelligent men don't just shine in what they know. Their strength lies in what they choose not to say. They've mastered the pause. They've learned that silence at the right time speaks louder than 1,000 clever words. I've watched men in boardrooms, in barbershops, on quiet walks under streetlights. And I've learned something. The ones with the deepest wisdom aren't the ones who interrupt. They're the ones who listen, who weigh their words, who don't rush to fill the silence just to be heard. And here's the truth. No one tells you. Every time you speak, you're either building your credibility or breaking it down. That's why the sharpest men avoid certain phrases, not because they're perfect, but because they've been burned. They've learned, often painfully, that some words cost more than they're worth. So today, we'll uncover 7 things wise men simply don't say. Not because they fear being wrong, but because they know the price of careless talk. Stick around, brother, and if you find yourself nodding, hit that subscribe button. Let's walk this road with clarity, strength, and a little more silence. I already know that. There's a sentence that sounds harmless, even confident, but it quietly poisons the mind. I already know that. I used to say it a lot, not out loud, but in my head. The moment someone offered advice or shared something familiar, I'd shut the door before it even opened. It happened once during a workshop years ago. An older speaker was walking us through a concept I'd read about a dozen times. I crossed my arms, tuned out, and thought, I've heard this before. But then he said something, one sentence, buried in the middle, that reframed everything I thought I understood, and I missed it. Because I was too busy convincing myself I already knew. That night, I realized something. When a man says, I already know that, what he's often saying is, I'm done learning. That's not intelligence. That's ego wearing a clever disguise. Stoicism doesn't flatter the ego. It dismantles it. It reminds us that the moment we stop being students of life, we start becoming prisoners of our own pride. Seneca once said, as long as you live, keep learning how to live. And that's not just a quote, it's a challenge. I once met a retired Navy officer at a coffee shop. He was in his 60s, sharp eyes, calm voice. We struck up a conversation, and I shared a thought I assumed he'd heard 100 times. But instead of brushing it off, he leaned in and asked, how did you come to that? I was stunned. This was a man who had commanded ships, led men into storms, and he still carried the humility to listen like a beginner. Afterward, he told me, the day I stop being curious is the day I start dying in slow motion. That stuck with me, because real intelligence doesn't interrupt to prove itself. It listens, it absorbs, it waits. The smartest men I know are never in a rush to show how much they know. They don't correct people mid-sentence. They don't use silence as a waiting room for their next opinion. They treat silence as a place of respect, a space where something new might enter, even if it's just a nuance, a detail, a shift in phrasing. It matters. So if you ever catch yourself thinking, "Yeah, I already know this," pause, lean in, because maybe, just maybe, you're not supposed to learn the fact. You're supposed to learn the perspective. That's what intelligent men understand. They don't collect knowledge like trophies. They treat it like a flowing river. You step in today, and it's not the same water as yesterday. They stay teachable. Because to grow, you must remain open. And to remain open, you must quiet the voice that insists, "I already know." 2. That's impossible. A few years ago, I worked with a man named Thomas. He had the kind of presence that made people trust his judgment. Firm, methodical, always in control. But there was one thing he said more often than anything else: "That won't work." Didn't matter what it was. A suggestion to expand our services, a new marketing approach, even a simpler way to do paperwork. His answer was always the same. At first, it sounded reasonable, grounded, practical. But after a while, I started noticing something deeper. Thomas wasn't evaluating ideas. He was reacting to fear. Fear of change, fear of failing, fear of uncertainty. He wasn't describing the world. He was describing his limits. And that phrase, "That won't work," became his shield. It kept him safe, but it also kept him small. The Stoics saw this clearly. Seneca once wrote, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality." Thomas wasn't lazy or foolish. He was just afraid of what he couldn't control. And so, he stopped trying. Fast forward a few years, I found myself in a project that should have been a disaster. Tight deadlines, half the budget, and a team that had never worked together. The old voice in me wanted to say, "There's no way this works." But instead, I remembered a question I once read in Marcus Aurelius's writings. What's within your power right now? So that's what I asked myself. What can I do today? What's the smallest useful action I can take? That became the rhythm. One small step, then the next, and the next. No big leaps, just steady movement. That project, it didn't just succeed, it transformed our entire department. Not because we had some genius plan, but because we didn't let fear pose as logic. When a man says, "That's impossible," he's not talking about the task. He's talking about his relationship to discomfort. Intelligent men don't run from the unknown. They face it in pieces, with calm, with focus, with discipline. They know that not seeing the whole path isn't a reason to stop walking. In fact, it's the reason to start. Stoic courage isn't reckless bravery. It's the persistence to act. Despite fear, despite odds, despite uncertainty, that's what separates noise from clarity. Fear says, wait until it's safe. Wisdom says, take the next step anyway. Because when you do, you'll often find the path wasn't blocked. You just hadn't walked far enough to see the way through. 3. That's not my fault. There's a quiet phrase that slips from a man's mouth in moments of pressure. That's not my fault. It sounds harmless, logical even, especially when things go wrong, in business, in love, in life. There's a natural urge to defend ourselves, to point out what wasn't our doing. But here's the hard truth. Every time we push responsibility away, we also push away our power to shape the outcome. Intelligent men understand this deeply. They've learned that responsibility isn't about assigning blame. It's about retaining influence. Because the moment you say, "It wasn't me," you also say, "There's nothing I can do." I once knew a guy named Mark. We worked together on a contract that went south fast. Deadlines were missed, miscommunication everywhere. The client walked, and Mark, he had the full list ready. The client was disorganized. The market conditions were rough. The team didn't deliver. All of it was partially true. But what he didn't see was this. While he was busy justifying himself, he lost the only thing that could have changed the next outcome: his ability to grow from it. He made the same mistake on the next project, and the next. Because when you refuse to own even a sliver of the problem, you forfeit your place in the solution. The Stoics were clear on this. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you respond that matters." And that response, it begins with ownership. The moment you take responsibility, you reclaim agency. You stop waiting for someone else to fix it. You start asking, what could I have done better? In my own life, this truth has changed everything. There were moments I wanted to defend myself, times when I was technically right. But when I paused and took a closer look, I saw the cracks I had ignored, the tone I used, the assumptions I made, the preparation I skipped. When you begin to say, "I could have handled that part better," something shifts. It's subtle but powerful. You stop being reactive. You become responsible, and responsibility is where strength lives. Blame is easy. It's cheap. It gets applause. But it keeps you stuck. Responsibility, it's heavier, but it builds muscle, of character, of wisdom. When you start choosing responsibility, you don't just fix the current problem. You become a better man for the next one. That's what intelligent men know. They don't wait to be rescued. They don't play the victim. They lead by example, not by finding someone to blame, but by finding a way forward. 4. I don't need any help. There's a quiet belief that creeps into the mind of many men. It doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself. It just whispers in the background, "I've got this. I don't need anyone." It sounds noble, even heroic, independent, strong, the kind of mindset we're taught to admire, the lone wolf, the silent warrior, the man who carries the weight of his world without ever asking for help. But here's the truth. Most won't say out loud that belief. It doesn't make you strong. It makes you slowly disappear inside yourself. Years ago, I met a man named Jacob. He was in his early 50s, successful by most standards, owned a business, raised 2 kids on his own, respected in his community, but he carried a weariness in his eyes that no one seemed to notice. Not because he was weak, but because he never let anyone see that he was tired. One night, over coffee, he told me something I never forgot. He said, "You know, for 20 years, I thought being strong meant never letting anyone carry any of my load. I thought if I shared it, I'd look soft, vulnerable, less of a man." And then he paused. That worked for a while, until it didn't. Until I realized no one knew how heavy things had gotten, because I never gave them a chance to care. That conversation changed me, because like Jacob, I believed the same lie. That asking for help was failure. That silence was strength. But the Stoics knew better. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor philosopher, wrote openly in his journal about the men who taught him, guided him, challenged him. He didn't pretend to be self-made. He credited his growth to those around him, even those who disagreed with him. If the most powerful man in the ancient world could admit that he leaned on others, why should we hide behind pride? The refusal to ask for help doesn't prove we're strong. It proves we're scared. Scared of being seen, scared of seeming weak, scared of giving up control, even for a moment. But here's the paradox. When you let someone help, you're not giving up power. You're expanding it, because connection, mutual support, is what makes a man resilient, not just tough. The Stoics didn't preach isolation. They taught self-mastery, yes, but they also believed we are part of a larger whole. We were built for cooperation, for brotherhood. Epictetus said, "No man is an island," and he meant it. The strongest among us are not those who carry every burden alone, but those who know when to say, "I can't do this alone." I've been there too. I've sat at my desk at midnight, drowning in pressure. Work deadlines, family stress, the silent war inside my own head. And I thought, if I just try harder, it'll get better. But it didn't. It got quieter, heavier, until I finally reached out. To a friend, to a mentor, to someone who would just listen. And in that moment, I didn't feel weak. I felt human again. What I found wasn't judgment. It was relief, clarity, strength, redefined. Because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is not to hold it all in, but to let someone in. So if you've ever caught yourself saying, "I don't need any help," pause for a second. Ask yourself, is that strength speaking, or pride dressed in armor? True strength isn't about how long you can stand alone. It's about knowing when to reach for a hand and when to offer yours to someone else. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. 5. I'm too old for that. There's a phrase that quietly ends more dreams than failure ever could. It rarely comes with drama or tears. It often sounds reasonable, even wise. I'm too old for that. It's a sentence we whisper to ourselves, sometimes as a joke, sometimes to avoid disappointment. But what lies beneath is rarely humor. It's resignation, the quiet kind that says, "My time has passed. The best parts are already behind me." And once that belief takes hold, it doesn't just shrink our possibilities. It begins to erode our sense of purpose. I once met a man named David. He was 67 when he enrolled in a photography course, not because he wanted a new career, but because he had always wanted to see the world through a different lens. At first, he felt out of place. The youngest student was in his 20s. The instructor was half his age. He told me, "There was a moment when I almost walked out. I thought to myself, what am I doing here? This is a young man's game." But he stayed, and by the end of the course, his final project, a photo series of elderly hands, was the most talked about in the entire class. It wasn't his skill that moved people. It was his perspective, his courage to believe that life hadn't stopped offering him meaning, and he hadn't stopped having something to give. That's what stuck with me, because I'm too old isn't a fact. It's a fear disguised as logic. The Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about death, not as a dark prophecy, but as a reminder to live fully until the final breath. He didn't ask, "How much time do I have left?" He asked, "What will I do with the time that remains?" That's the real question. I've seen men in their 60s start new businesses, learn to paint, fall in love again, mentor boys who never had fathers. I've also seen men much younger give up on themselves far too soon. The difference was never age. It was mindset. The man who says, "I'm too old for that," closes a door that was never locked. But the man who asks, "What can I still do?" pushes it wide open. Stoic wisdom tells us that growth doesn't retire. It matures. It becomes more intentional, more focused, not rushed, not reckless, but rooted in clarity. That's the gift of age. You don't chase everything. You choose what matters. Your experiences become your compass. Your scars become your stories. And your time, your most precious asset. So no, you're not too old. You're too valuable to waste what's left. Whether you have 10 years ahead or just 10 days, there's still something waiting to be lived, something waiting to be built or shared or learned. Don't let a quiet lie steal what's still yours. Ask yourself, what would I do if I didn't believe it was too late? Then, take the first step. 6. I'll do it later. Few phrases feel more innocent and more dangerous than this. I'll do it later. It sounds reasonable, responsible even, like we're planning ahead. But more often than not, later becomes a soft grave, where our most important intentions go to die. I once knew a man named Eric. He had a great job, 2 sons, a wife who adored him. From the outside, everything looked steady, but on the inside, he carried a list. A growing list of things he promised himself he'd get to. He'd say, "I'll write that letter next week. I'll take the boys camping when work slows down. I'll fix things with my brother after the holidays." But life didn't wait. One afternoon, Eric got a call. His brother had passed in an accident. No final talk, no closure, just silence, and a message draft that was never sent. He told me this story not for sympathy, but to remind me how fragile time really is. We think we have more of it until we don't. The Stoics never romanticized time. They saw it for what it was, finite, unpredictable, and beyond our control. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "You could leave life right now." It wasn't morbid. It was a call to clarity, because delay steals something subtle. Not just opportunity, but peace of mind. When we put off what matters, the call, the apology, the creative idea, we carry it around like a stone in our pocket. It weighs on us. Even when we forget it's there, it's shaping how we move, how we feel, how we look at the world. I've done it too. There were letters I meant to send, but let gather dust in my drawer. Conversations I meant to have, but convinced myself the moment wasn't right. And each delay became a tiny regret. Small, quiet, but they added up. Until one day, I stopped waiting. I picked up the phone. I said what I needed to say, and something shifted. The heaviness left. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about no longer pretending. That later was guaranteed. That's what Stoicism teaches. Not to rush, but to act with purpose. Before time makes the decision for us. It's not about doing everything today, but it is about doing what matters, even if it's just one small thing, because the man who waits for perfect timing often ends up living with perfect regret. 7. That's just how I am. There's a phrase that seems harmless. You've probably said it to yourself, maybe in a moment of frustration, maybe to end a conversation. That's just how I am. It sounds like self-awareness, like acceptance, but more often than not, it's not a reflection of peace. It's a quiet form of surrender. Because hidden underneath those 5 words is the decision to stop growing. I once worked with a man named Neil, brilliant at his job, fiercely independent, but known for one thing, his temper. He'd raise his voice in meetings, snap at teammates, storm out of discussions when things didn't go his way. And when someone finally confronted him, he just shrugged and said, "That's who I've always been." As if that made it untouchable, unchangeable, permanent. But here's the truth. What we do repeatedly, what we excuse continuously, becomes our identity, not because it's who we are, but because we stop challenging it. The Stoics never believed character was fixed. They believed it was formed by practice, by reflection, by conscious choice. Epictetus said, "It's not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Likewise, it's not our nature that limits us, but the stories we tell ourselves about what that nature is. Change is uncomfortable. It pulls us out of what's familiar, even when that familiarity hurts us. But growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from courage. The courage to ask hard questions. Is this really who I am? Or is this just what I've gotten used to being? I've asked myself that question many times. Years ago, I had a pattern. Whenever someone challenged my ideas, I'd shut down, not out of anger, but fear of being wrong, fear of not being respected, fear of letting someone see where I hadn't figured it all out yet. And I would say, "That's just how I think," as if it were carved in stone. But it wasn't. What was really happening was that I didn't want to face what changing would require: vulnerability, humility, effort. And those things are uncomfortable. But they're also the birthplace of wisdom, because intelligent men, they don't avoid change. They don't run from the work. They do it, not because they hate who they are, but because they respect themselves too much to stay stuck there. Stoicism teaches that self-mastery isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. You don't become wise by accident. You become wise by showing up every day and asking yourself, what can I do better today, even if it's uncomfortable? That's how identity is shaped, not in declarations, but in choices, day after day. So when someone says, "That's just how I am," I hear something else now. I hear fear. I hear fatigue. I hear someone who's tired of trying, but hasn't yet realized that trying is the most human thing we do. We are not finished, not while we're still breathing. Nature is change. Life is change. And resisting that is resisting the very thing that makes us alive. So, if you've ever said that phrase, and we all have, know this: you're not stuck. You're not fixed. You're in motion, and the direction you go starts with the next decision you make. If something today stirred a quiet thought in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this with someone who's walking their own path in silence. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Not for noise, but for reminders that stillness has power. I'll meet you in the next reflection.